Check one.
And I'll go check that.
I start the recording.
Good morning. Thanks for being here for this extremely interesting chat on Latin America's economic stagnation, populism, and democracy. As you know, Latin America and Caribbean face a unique set of economic, political, and social challenges. Chronic economic stagnation caused by stubborn lack of productivity growth has left citizens in the region dissatisfied. We have seen significant social unrest episodes in the last decade, a significant deepening of polarization in the political spectrum in Latin America. But then at the same time, we have seen world trends shifting in a way that many circles of Latin American reality have signaled that maybe are at the start of a very positive decade for geopolitical tensions were Latin America a good location for important parts of global value chains that might be finding a new home or close to largest consumer markets in the world, several countries in Latin America, the US. On the other hand, when we look at the energy transition that the world is undertaking, Latin America is also extremely well positioned for that in the extent it's renewable energy, it's about of the natural resources that are needed. Therefore, there are also very positive news for Latin America. So, I mean, this is the context, and we are, I mean, extremely pleased to have, I mean, an oversight of many people around this table, including myself, Michael Lee, who is an author, journalist, and speaker specializing in Latin America, Spanish, and international affairs. In 2023, he was appointed as a visiting professor at the School of Public Policy, LLC. From 1994 to 2023, he was a staff journalist for The Economist. From 2014 to 2022, he wrote the Bello column on Latin America and was a senior editor and Spain correspondent. Prior to that, he was the magazine's America's editor, its correspondent in Brazil, consumer industries correspondent in Mexico and Central America. He spent most of the 1980s covering the Andean region for The Guardian and the BBC. Recently published a book, Spain, the Trials and Triumphs of a Modern European Country. And he also published a couple of very important books on Latin America, one of them called The Forgotten Continent, the History of the New Latin America, and the other one, Brazil, the Rise of a Global Power. So we're extremely grateful to have Michael with us, and we will structure today's conversation. Michael will give some introductory remarks on his views on where Latin America is heading, challenges, opportunities, etc. And then we will have a conversation. Mike. Okay.
Thank you very much indeed, Alejandro. Can I just check if you can hear me properly or not? Yeah, down at the bottom. Can you hear? Okay. Yeah, good. Thank you very much. Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be here when Alejandro proposed such a finally come here. We were in a medieval monastery in Seville, in Spain. We were actually at a conference. I mean, Spain not only has a good part of life. And I'm delighted to accept it. It's a while to organize. I'm very grateful to him. We can use it. 20 minutes, I want to summarize what's happened in the last 45 years in a region of 660 million people. So, really schematic. The first thing one has to say from Latin America is that the organization is problematic, and Uruguay and Chile are not the same as Uruguay. We are common fact. And if one refuses to generalize, one things out. I'm here to say anything beyond that in particular of, and that's not a very good recipe for living. Just to summarize at the beginning, this is on. Cover more I mean, in short, I think the Latin America, much of Latin America is trapped in ambitious social frustration and democratic decay, which reinforce each other. The good news is that despite that, there's more resilience to than meets the other. And there are these reasons which I have just outlined. I mean, if one looks back over the 44 years since 1980, which was the first four big steps of change. One was democratization. remains extreme by world standards, but it did fall quite a lot in the first dozen years or so of the century. And gender and racial inequality exist, but I think they're more contested than in the past. If one thinks back 15 years, there was a lot of optimism in the region. I mean, the commodity boom. Power and so on. There's no doubt that the last 10 years or so have been much in the region, much more turbulent. I mean, there's been another decade with GDP expanding since 2015, compared to 2.2% for the original last decade. Real terms, if they can account income per person, is slightly lower than so looking at this form. Politically, democracy in many countries in the region. Political scientists used to imagine that democratic circulation was a one-way street. So once you lose it, well, the reality is that if you without Cuba, which was I think 60 region, it's very in Nicaragua, I think, and some of them in other countries where democracy survived, it's suffering decay, and I will talk about what I mean by that in political science terms, but I think it's pretty obvious. So what has gone wrong? Let me start with saying what I think is not wrong, and that's the Washington consensus, which is often blamed for everything in Latin America. And the post-Washington consensus, which has evolved, macro framework, has delivered stability and a certain resilience. If you leave aside two countries that abandoned it, which is Venezuela and Argentina, it facilitated a pretty swift macroeconomic in the pandemic. Swift is the most unexpected. Right? Yes, there was social scars, but macroeconomic did its job. I think it's also done its job in terms of dealing with inflation. I mean, the main central banks in Latin America were quicker than those in Europe. And they were quicker to they're now in a position to it's a pretty textbook stuff. And the sound amount of it's also during the pandemic that many governments provide emergency aid, not as much, but much more than in the past. So I think it's three other big things. The first is money. There's a chronic lack of growth created, and there's little sign of that changing much in the medium term. And the underlying reason is woeful. Black American businesses are just not productive enough. In Latin American workers are only 24% as productive as their US counterparts. And that's down from 27% in Latin America. That period, workers in Eastern Europe and various Asian countries have become. When I say workers, that's just measuring labor productivity. It doesn't mean they play. It's the context in which they have to work. So why? Well, I think there's a lot of reasons. They include the fact that two works in the informal. But even formal firms is relatively because of lack of competition, because of poor worker training, insufficient export experience, poor management, international standards, as well as poor infrastructure. Over-regulation and the dysfunction of America's mega city contribute to informality. Many workers face a 2-hour commute or longer if they want a formal job, and in overcrowded public. The lack of childcare or cultural resistance means that women prefer to invent work rather than cross the city to work. So in other words, a big factor behind is lack of security, public transport, effective regulation. And that is one place that is second historically weak states, sometimes captured by private interests and incapable enforcement of the law. And the a long way, and Latin America in the 2 centuries of independence has been much more successful than the next independent states. Very historical and geographic reason for that, and it's very well. But it's become an ever bigger problem because of the swiftly growing power of organized crime in the region. There's a chilling statistic that some of you will know. Latin America accounts for 8.4% of the world's population, 7.4% of the economy, and around 30%. In this century, organized crime associated with the drug credits from the northern Andes across the region, and it's increasingly penetrating. As a result, security ranks with the economy at the top of the concerning the region in some countries. And I think the third thing is going wrong. The problem that is at the same time key to the solution is democratic culture itself, as is now practiced in many countries. Rightly or wrongly, in many countries, the political class is perceived to be corrupt. The political systems are failing to deliver better public services or reform to raise the rate of that the population demand. And at the same time, economic stagnation, or at least the slow growth, depending on where you are, has narrowed opportunity, especially for younger Latin. And these are the generations who have more years of education in their parents, and they often put into debt to pay for an education which they expect to give them a good professional job. Very understandably with parents. And they have the generations that are behind them out on the street in the social expressions which took place in several countries. And those social expressions, one phase of this picture of negative political trends, which include populism, and polarization, and fragmentation. Populism, properly defined, often is neither of the right, but it's a method of practice with 3 essential elements. The leader who brings a special and direct bond with the people, and the leader defines who the people are. It's the leader also defines an enemy, and the enemy is essential to the population. It can be the empire, this country, in the case of Yugoslavia, it can be the oligarchy, it can be the caste, the oligarchy and the people, and there's my level of export profits leader. Normally, the caste is heavy in the lay, the populist leader is the hard right. And that's a phrase, interestingly, coined by 2 Italian publicists, used by the five-star movement, adopted by other races, then Spain, then adopted. Illustrates the point that populism can do without. In the 1990s and into the 2000s in some countries, there was a broad reformist political centre in Latin America. They tended to evolve or at least accept the technocratic approach. There's many yeah, it sounds better. And so I think that broad centre and the technocratic approach they're under great strain. They've diminished. They've lost public credibility. And that's because of social media, which tends to simplify. And if you try to get across the importance of evidence-based public policy, so the result has been the straightforward extremes and the weakening of the centre. There's been much commentary about a second big tide in Latin America in recent years, comparable, compared by some with the so-called first big tide of Lula and Hugo Chavez. I think it was always misreading because many political trends in recent years was anti-democracy, riots and violence, people voted for the left. And that happened until last year. It started changing last year when we saw who in many ways represented the same party. And I think there's a shift to the right because began with delayed with the election of the Chilean constitution last year, and so on. And that's partly because of the security issue, and partly because the left taking the identity. So I think the anti-incumbent trend, we will see it weakening again this year, probably in Mexico, in the Dominican Republic, possibly in the elections this year. And I think that also partly reflects a change in the mood in Parliament. People are focused on basic points, keeping safe and putting food on the table, more than they were a few years. Polarization interacts with another trend in the region, which is fragmentation. Political parties never particularly strong, have splintered. And many new parties are simply personal vehicles. In Peru and Guatemala, no party is the president once. You have this multiplication of parties that makes government and makes a semblance of reform. It also means, because in Latin America you have directly elected presidents with proportional representation of the legislature, which is a unique in some respects. Most countries segunda vueltas, second rounds, in runoffs. It means that presidents can get elected having won only about 15% of the vote. One on the first round, but the genuine person. We elect one president. And that is a problem as well, I think. So I think the challenge facing Latin America, as in many parts of Europe, is to reinvent politics with digital, artificial intelligence, for a new generation. That inevitably new forms of globalization and new forms of and it's easy to say that to work it out. And going to be, I think, the generation of students today or recently seen it's going to be up to you to develop that span because for people of my generation understand historically the kind of political paralysis tended to be resolved. Fortunately, there are forces in the region that are jumping up the politics now. And we saw that in Brazil last autumn, autumn 2022, where we now know that Jair Bolsonaro asked the commander to strategically against the election. And they said, yes, we have to shut him down. So that's not in other words, an elected civilian autocrat who is very, very effective responding to popular demand. In the case of El Salvador, bank insecurity, and food and so that is spreading their in the daytime, and by knocking out more than 1% of the population, is so that has enabled that enormous popularity to not decide term, not decide values. Now, there would be repairs across that line. Leaving aside whether it's a good or bad, just an analytical term, the problem is in many other is not where you have essentially very small country, where you have essentially new gangs, which is right? That's not the same as transnational organized crime, which is the big problem in most countries, right? So, just to end, and I've said less about the bright side, partly because you said quite a lot about it, with which I agree. I mean, if politics was working better, this really could be a very good moment for Latin America, I think. Partly because for comparative reasons, you know, things are less bad than they are in many other parts of the world. And there are these big opportunities to boost economic growth, nearshoring, which is already happening in some countries. It's happening in Mexico and parts of Central America, Dominican Republic, and a bit in Colombia. It could happen much, much more in Central America. It could happen much, much more. Then there's the green energy transition and its demand for lithium, for copper, and so on, which particularly South American countries are in a very good position to provide, providing the political system can process social discontents and social demands around big mining. I mean, I personally think big mining does far less environmental damage than illegal mining, which is growing very, very fast and damagingly in countries like Brazil and Peru and Bolivia. But you know, there's a challenge there. I mean, the political system has to process those demands. And then there's the world demand for food, which Latin America is in a good position to provide as well. But to make the most of these opportunities, I think you need political systems to work better, and you need the rule of law to work better, because citizens need the rule of law, but also investors need the rule of law. You know? And that's, so I think I mean, for this institute, I think there's a very challenging and interesting, fascinating research agenda, actually, you know, in all these things, on productivity, on reinventing democratic politics, and on the rule of law in particular. And so let's have a conversation.
for the region, no? And in that sense, and I mean, you ended up mentioning that we might need, and I think you had a very deep point in saying we keep on discussing whether we need to reform the electricity sector or the oil sector or the tax reform. Maybe you were saying, I mean, given these whole trends that you described, given technology, etc., maybe we need a different way of organizing our politics to actually limit polarization, foster consensus building, and being able to operate the next stage of democratization in Latin America, making it more functional. And maybe when you look at some of these countries that at least have been able to avoid populism, for example, you see Boric in Chile. I mean, the first government since Allende that includes, I mean, the Communist Party in his coalition, etc. But at the end of the day, respecting the rule of law, respecting the division of powers. Are there any lessons there? I mean, you actually had the youth coming to power, the people that were in the education and education protest now becoming government and acting in a much more healthy, institutional, and respectful of the rule of law way than some of the old populists that we see in other countries. No, and maybe Uruguay is too little, I don't know, but I mean, there you have, I mean, a very civilized alternation of power that is working. Are there any lessons there to be learned? Are there too idiosyncratic to extrapolate? Or, I mean, how do you see the possibility, the change, examples on how to forge the new political systems that might be workable?
Yeah, I think, I mean, tragically, Uruguay is only 0.5% of the Latin
Yeah.
American population, because it's a great country. But it's also, and what's one of the secrets, I think, that it has strong political parties, and it still has strong political parties. But Uruguay is an old country. It's a country of old people, and therefore some of these processes have not happened there. Young people tend to immigrate, right? And that's a problem for Uruguay. But I think Chile is really interesting, and I'm moderately optimistic because for the reasons you say. I went there in January and talked to a lot of people, and I think it is moving back to a more moderate politics than it's had over the last few years. As you, I mean, President Boric, he is a Democrat, and that is very, very important. He's a Democrat without any qualifications, you know, I mean, any reservations about that. And he has learned very, very fast, and he's had a lot to learn, one might say. But he's now governing in a much more centrist way. I think it's interesting, the fact that the hard left won a majority in the first constituent assembly, and their constitutional draft was overwhelmingly rejected. And then the hard right won very close to a majority in the second constituent council, and its draft was rejected as well. In a backhanded, odd sort of way, actually, the existing constitution has been legitimated by those votes, right? And nobody's talking now about a new constitutional exercise. Much rather, there is a recognition across much, not all, but much of the political spectrum, that you need to focus on specific political reforms, which you can do in the Congress, which will be constitutional amendments, but you can now do them in the Congress more easily than in the past, which is to do with actually reversing the fragmentation which has happened in Chile because of the change in the electoral system under President Bachelet. I think a focus now on better public policy. There's still a big divide on the size of the state in Chile, and with the left saying Chile is now a much more richer country than it was, and the tax take has to go up as a percentage of the economy, because that's what always happens as countries get richer, because citizens demand more expensive services, to put it bluntly. And the services themselves cost more because the country is richer. And the right saying, no, it's the problems began with the tax reform under Bachelet, which was badly done. But so there's still a way to go, but I think there is a return to moderation. I think the next government will probably be a moderate government, probably of the center right. We'll see what happens to the influence of Jose Antonio Cast on the hard right leader on that government. I think, Colombia, President Petro is a less convinced Democrat than or he's less of a liberal Democrat, let's put it that way, than Gabriel Boric. He is, in his DNA, is Latin American nationalist populism, is often reading books brought out for campaigns. It's not very interesting. Autobiographies is not very interesting. I read his autobiography brought out for the campaign, the 2022 campaign. And actually, I found it fascinating, partly because he said several times how incredibly intelligent he is, which tells you something about his personality. But partly also because about a third of the book is devoted to his time in the M19. And he wasn't actually an arms-carrying guerrilla. He didn't shoot anybody. He was a clandestine political activist for the M19. The M19 was a classic nationalist, populist political movement, right? And it tells you a lot about Petro. And I think he made a big mistake in throwing out, he began his government with a broad center-left coalition with some very capable technocrats like Jose Antonio Ocampo, etc. And then he threw them out after 9-10 months, whatever it was. And he's now governing essentially with activists. He's talking about constituent assembly. I don't think it'll happen. And I think one thing about Colombia is that the institutions are still quite strong. And, I think the most probable scenario is that President Petro finishes his term. Unfortunately, he won't have achieved all that much because he tried to achieve too much. He wanted to change everything. And usually if you want to try and change everything, you end up changing almost nothing. The one thing he's done is the tax increase, which Ocampo did. But I think there'll be there'll be an election or a new president in Colombia. There's less underlying progress now than there was in Colombia, but I think there is. Colombia, I'm not completely pessimistic about. Dominican Republic as well. It's an interesting country. And Brazil, we'll see. But and Mexico, we'll see. But I don't think, and between them, they are 2/3 of Latin America. So they're important, and or 60%, whatever. I'm not wholly pessimistic about either of them. So, but I think there are these underlying processes which go beyond particular elections and particular leaders, which are not perhaps being fully addressed.
Yeah. No, so let me open it up to questions from the table. We can go around the table. Whoever has a question, please, introduce yourself and let's have a dialogue.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Professor Werner. Thank you, Mr. Reed, for these amazing guidelines you gave us around the recent development of Latin American political, social, and historical context. Now, I want to retake one piece of your introduction about the dictatorships argument. One of the features of dictatorships in history has been the immobilization of society in order to spread oppression. It does not seem to me to be the case of Venezuela. It's a context in which there is perhaps too much political and social vibrancy. That is the reason for which there is polarization and for which the opposition itself struggles to find alternatives, because the context is full of political action. And I add to that, taking from the title of the conference, the resilience, perhaps not democratic as Robert Dahl would like, of Maduro, because with debatable efficiency, Maduro has been resilient in staying in power since 2013 from all sorts of economic clashes, political struggle, and more. Now, I would like to know, where do you believe a future Maduro government can take Venezuela in face of the next US elections? Do you see a possible new Trump administration as a creation of warfare in terms of political discourse against Venezuela, or do you see a possibility of dialogue between Venezuela and the US, as the Barbados Agreement suggested, and then for a plethora of reasons it did not happen? Where do you see the Venezuela-US future going on?
If you don't mind, can I ask where you're from?
I'm Italian. Alberto Maresca from the Master in Latin American Studies.
I thought you might be Argentine from the question. About because of your point about the immobilization of society, which was true of Argentina and Chile. The first few years of the dictatorship in Chile, not after that. I think it was not true of Brazil or Peru in the 1970s, for example, which had military dictatorships. I would disagree with you on that. I think the essential characteristic of dictatorship is the elimination of effective political choice and competition, and the elimination of independent institutions and checks and balances and curbs on civil society. So in terms of Venezuela, I'm afraid I'm much gloomier than you are. I mean, yes, the regime, I always used to talk a lot to Teodoro Petkov in my visits to Venezuela, a great man, really great man, who was a guerrilla leader in the 1960s and became a social democrat, formed a democratic political party, and was a very intelligent critic of Chavez, mainly because he knew that, partly because he knew the left intimately, right? He was hopeful until the last few years, because he died about 5-6 years ago, something like that from memory. That those 40 years of democracy in Venezuela under what Chavez called the Fourth Republic, from 1958 to 1998, had created a political culture, a democratic political culture, which was going to be strong enough to survive Chavez. And I think that's why you saw mobilization on many occasions, in many periods under Chavez. But, slowly that political culture has been eroded. A quarter of the population have chosen to leave or been pushed out or whatever. So I think Venezuela, there's a clique in power that no longer has popular support. Chavez was many things, but amongst other things, he was an extraordinarily effective, charismatic leader, right? And he did have genuine popular support, partly because there were some tangible benefits. You can question whether they were well done and all the rest of it in terms of housing and social benefits, right? But Maduro is not. The regime is no longer popular. The economy is a quarter or a third of the size it was. You've had that immigration. Its insecurity has become slightly less of a problem than it was a few years ago, partly because a lot of the criminals have migrated. But I think that clique in power, usufruct power, they do very well at it. And they're also scared of losing. They're scared of the consequences of losing, right? The one doubt in my mind is what happens. Vladimiro Padrino, the defense minister and head of the armed forces, has been in the job for, off the top of my head, about 12 plus years. Usually you would be in that job for a couple of years, So clearly he's irreplaceable. What happens if he needs to be replaced? But you have, the very significant role of Cuba in Venezuela and the Cuban intelligence service, which provides security for the regime. And, I see no reason to believe that their grip on power is going to be loosened in the next few years. And I think the US has no good policy option on Venezuela, you know. Sanctions are not very effective in today's world. You know, you can evade them, as Venezuela has done. It costs, but you can evade them, right? So what do? You know, I mean, it's not easy.
Sanctions are not effective or are less effective than we thought. But what's going on in Venezuela, I mean, Venezuela has had the largest economic collapse in modern history. Part of that is of their own making, has nothing to do with the sanctions. But in a way, the regime has survived the worst economic scenario. So there's something intrinsic about the way they're managing the political situation that goes beyond what the rest of the world can do on Venezuela, no? I mean, my point on sanctions is that regardless of whether it was sanctions, the outcome that the best sanctions will get you is a huge economic collapse. You had that, but you didn't have regime change. So
But,
there are other
yeah.
very strong forces.
No, I think the regime has effective political control of the country. It doesn't have effective territorial control, which is not the same thing, right? It has effective political control. But I think it's also, I mean, who 30 years ago would have thought that they would have been prepared to pay the political cost of a quarter of the population migrating and the economy collapsing on that scale? I mean, you know, the previous conventions would have been that, you know, they, in those waves of popular mobilization, there would have been a split and they would have been overthrown. Now, why hasn't that happened? I think, I mean, the Cuban role is important and shouldn't be minimized. I mean, there are, you know, I met people in the armed forces who then later tried to organize a democratic coup against the regime, and they were arrested immediately. I mean, the capacity for surveillance is now much, much greater than it was 30, 40 years ago. No? And I think the costs of abandoning democracy, the international costs are much lower than they were, because democracy is on the defensive in the world, because you can get allies, as they have, in not just Cuba, but Russia, India, Iran, China, in different ways, to different degrees, and the Emirates, for example. A lot of Venezuelan trade, and Turkey, you know, and a lot of trade happens in those places. And the US is simply not the kind of power that it was 30, 40 years ago in terms of being able to impose its will. And I think the regional consensus on defending democracy is weaker than it was, you know, and for all those reasons. And you will.
Other questions?
Nicaragua, looking at the future, and Salvador, concerning both rule of law, basically weakening every single day, two different regimes. What's your take on, you know, you mentioned very pessimistic about Venezuela. I tend to be the same for Nicaragua, and big question mark for Bukele. What's your thought on those two countries?
Yeah, I think, you know, Venezuela is partly patrimonial regime in which the extended families of those in power have benefited hugely. I think Nicaragua was completely a patrimonial regime, you know? And it's a small country. They killed a lot of people. They imprisoned a lot of people. They've removed citizenship from a significant number of people. And they haven't screwed up the economy in the same way, right? So, you know, the plan is obviously that if and when Danielle dies, that Rosario, his wife, will take over. She has a lot of, you know, antibodies, let's say, in Nicaraguan society. I mean, she provokes a lot of antibodies. Let's see, and then there are the children, no? I mean, So let's see, is that going to be viable? I don't know, you know? I mean, I think Bukele is a different case in the sense that, I mean, although he began his political life in the FMLN, I mean, he's not a leftist. I mean, even rhetorically. I mean, Nicaragua is kind of 19th century, isn't it? I mean, this regime, it's extraordinary in many ways, no? I think Bukele is much more of a kind of threat, if you like, because he's much more successful. You know? I mean, or at least is much more open to being copied. I mean, one wonders, and some people worry that Honduras is going down the same road as Bukele and Nicaragua, kind of mixture of the two. I mean, these are small countries with security problems and without strong democratic tradition, let's say. So yeah, who knows? I mean, I think in general, the Northern Triangle is obviously, and Guatemala is big hope, isn't it? But it's a rather slender hope in the sense that I think there's no doubt that there actually US pressure was very, very important because it's a small country and it has a lot of economic ties with the US. It's close. And what worries me is that the support for democracy in Guatemala did not appear to be bipartisan in this country. And so we'll see what happens.
Thank you. I just want to follow on the El Salvador case. And so what is the alternative? We do we have operations across Central and South America. And the Bukele model is very popular among the populations in many of these countries because of the security risks. And so I'm curious, what is the alternative to the Bukele approach? Because a lot of people, as you indicated, Honduras, but other countries as well. I mean, if you look at some of the actions taking place in Ecuador right now and how to deal with the spread of the cartels and the drug trade across the region, you can see, you know, you have threats in Peru, you have threats even in countries like Costa Rica, where the ports have become much more dangerous and the local cities have become more destabilized. So I'm curious, what do you see as the alternative to the Bukele approach? And I'm not advocating the Bukele approach, but I am saying that amongst many people that I speak with in these countries, they see it as the only solution, even if it's just an interim solution to deal with the problem.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of Latin Americans look at it positively for that reason, you know. So, I mean, I think the alternative, as I was trying to argue, is a more effective democratic politics, which actually delivers concrete improvements for the mass of citizens, you know. I mean, which includes security, but they also include economic opportunity, and they include better public services. And these are basic, very, very important things. And if democracy can't deliver them, then increasingly Latin Americans will look for other people who can deliver them. And, you know, that is starting to happen in some countries. I mean, I don't think Noboa is really Bukele, actually. I think he made a huge mistake last week in even taking into account the provocation that Lopez Obrador provided, but it was a huge mistake. He shouldn't have done it in invading the embassy. But I think Bukele is actually, I mean, is in a way like Alvaro Uribe without the political skills that Alvaro Uribe had in his heyday. I mean, I think I don't think he's trying to do a Bukele and lock up 1% of the Ecuadorian population. You know, I mean, I think he's trying to restore the control of the state, restore the monopoly of force of the state, which involves building maximum security prison. It requires reforming the prison service. It requires, as a temporary expedient, having the army on the street. If it becomes permanent, that will be a problem. But he's very inexperienced. He's young. I mean, Uribe, like him or not, he was a brilliant retail politician. I mean, in a discussion we had yesterday, Arturo Sarucan described Lopez Obrador as the best retail politician that Mexico's ever had, which I agree with. But I think Uribe was a brilliant retail politician as well. You know? So I think, I mean, Bukele is the specter because he's so successful at the moment, but it's not very exportable. Just because El Salvador is a small country and had a particular problem. Huh?
Thank you very much to all of you, Professor Reed. Nice to see you again. Thanks for your presentation. My question is more related to the rule of law, public international law in general, because as you mentioned, rule of law at the moment is a big issue in Latin America, even concerning Venezuela, for example, the question that our colleague made before, sanctions didn't work either. There's really a way, perhaps a small hope for democracy in Venezuela as it is for a full democracy in other parts of Latin America. And lately I've been hearing about, well, where is public international law in all this as well, concerning not only the big international picture and the wars that of course are out there, but concerning Latin America and the rule of law, whether there's a role for that, and then would like to know, what do you think about the role of the United States concerning this Latin American labyrinth? Do you think there's really concrete ways that there might be some support, if we can put it like that? Or how do you see this with the United States in Latin American? What role do you think it can play, especially concerning democratic resilience and the rule of law? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I mean, there's kind of two questions there, isn't there? But no, I always remember when discussing the rule of law, Gordon Brown, the former UK Prime Minister, once said, when it comes to the rule of law, the first 500 years are the hardest. And I think he's right. I mean, the rule of law is harder to construct than electoral democracy, I think, because it requires effective legal systems, judiciaries. It requires effective police. It requires effective prisons and not corrupt in all those cases. And it also requires an acceptance of the legitimacy of the law on the part of the citizens, right? And some shared norms. And it kind of worries me in some countries, including Peru, right? At the moment, I think acceptance of those shared norms is breaking down. And that's partly to do with social change, which the political system is not processing properly. But that's a long discussion. I mean, I actually think countries have to do the job themselves, and that you can't import it. I think the US could help. Partly US inspired, and when one says the US here, it's not just the administration, it's also the US NGOs and civil societies. I mean, attempts to kind of adopt judicial reform in Latin America, which happened in many countries and which were pushed by international organizations in the 1990s, 2000s, were not terribly effective at the end of the day. You know, I think the problem goes deeper than that. It worries me that I think we're seeing judicial independence, which has never been especially strong in Latin America. I think it's getting weaker. And I think, you know, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, there was a lot of talk, which, you know, and I wrote about this and so on, about the anti-corruption offensives in various countries, especially Brazil and Peru. and a new generation of judges and prosecutors, better educated, often with experience abroad and so on. And yet we saw those efforts undermined because they were politicized, and that was true of Brazil, and it was true of Peru in a different way. And you know, these prosecutors were out to get particular politicians, irrespective of the strength of the evidence in some cases. And so now we're seeing the revenge of the political class against the anti-corruption offensive. And that's, and we're seeing a kind of reverse politicization of the judiciary, a politicization in a different direction. And you can see it in Brazil, you can see it in Peru, and in other countries it's perhaps less strong because the anti-corruption offensive was less strong, you know. And so there is few countries where I think there is a reasonably independent judiciary, but I mean, it's a problem, but I think it's a problem Latin America has to solve. The outside world can help, sometimes with money, sometimes with examples, sometimes with encouragement, you know, but it's a job that has to be done nationally.
Yeah, you hadn't said much, unless I missed the beginning of your talk. But since I came, you hadn't said very much about Argentina, which I think is a democracy facing more serious economic problems than any democracy I can think of. I wonder if you think there's at this point much alternative to Milei-type policies, especially given you could make a case for a more gradualist, liberal, democratic approach, but that seemed to get nowhere under the Macri administration, for example. I'd just be interested in your take of whether you think the guy is going too far, or whether you think that this is really the only way to go, given the nature of the problem.
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's probably the most kind of newsworthy question in Latin America at the moment, right? One of them. I think there's no doubt that Milei is a product of the mismanagement of the economy by Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, especially, but also the failure of Macri. And that failure is kind of tragic in a way, because they were quite close to success in many ways, you know, but they believed in their own propaganda, which, you know, they're not alone in that. They thought it was enough that, you know, they were included people with Wall Street experience, and they talked the right language to the markets and all that kind of stuff. Then the markets would give them a lot of time. And I think the turning point, well, there were several, but I would pick out after they did, because they adopted a gradual approach, they did quite well in the midterm elections in, talking about, I always get dates muddled up, but it was around 2018, yeah. And then immediately afterwards, they, it might have been 2017, I think it was 2017 actually, yeah. And there was a big demonstration against pension reform, which means pension cuts, outside the Congress, which turned violent, and they got scared. And they basically kind of watered down the reform, or withdrew it from memory. I think the markets noticed that, and there came a point at which suddenly, and this is true of debt sustainability everywhere. Debt is sustainable until suddenly it isn't, you know. But you've discovered that ex post, you know, and many people, I think, did warn them, you know, but I mean, and this was the Argentine winter of 2019, and the run on the peso, and when you had to organize some more money for them, and they never recovered from that. But you know, Macri got in the election, he did actually much better than the polls suggested. He wasn't that far away from winning. But the society digested all that as a failure. The Macristas digested it as the fault of gradualism. And so there were important people in the Macri camp who drew the lesson that you have to do shock therapy. And those people were happy to align with Millet. Is Millet the most effective salesman for shock therapy? Well, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that his kind of slash and burn assault, rhetorical assault on the political class means that he's, and that he won the election promising shock therapy, means that he's preserved that 56% popularity longer than many others might. But no, in the sense that, I mean, you need the political class in order to deliver the shock therapy. It's a democracy, right? And now, I mean, I read this morning that the government is now starting to negotiate with the governors and the Congress on a new, slimmer emergency law, which has the important things. So, I mean, one imagined that they went for broke because they thought that if they asked for 200%, they might get 50% of what they wanted, right? But then the question is, I think it was a seminar last week I was listening to, somebody said, the problem is, do they know what's the 50% that's really important, you know, and can they work that out? Well, maybe they will. So, yeah, it would have been good if there was a more gradualist alternative, at least in terms of the human cost of this. But I mean, I think Argentines are prepared to accept it, provided it works. I think the real problem for Milei and for Argentina will be if inflation isn't coming down quite, I mean, really palpably and significantly by the Argentine winter months, you know. And, you know, restoring growth will take a little bit longer, but by the end of this year, you need some green shoots, I think. Otherwise, I think they're in trouble.
Thank you very much indeed for an absolutely wonderful presentation. I always try to see where I can disagree with whoever is speaking, and I find myself that wherever I have a disagreement is measured in less than millimeters. I was wondering whether you could address what I believe is the gaping wound in Latin America, not just Latin America, but the whole of the Western Hemisphere, which is Haiti. Everything you have said, comparado con el resto del mundo, we're really quite well off. And if we go all the way back to 1830, comparado con el resto del mundo, we're pretty stable and pretty peaceful. But the one gaping wound is Haiti. And I was just wondering whether you have any views about that, particularly when you think that at one point, the United Nations peacekeepers there were headed by the Brazilian army and a very distinguished Brazilian general. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm really not an expert on Haiti at all, I have to say. I mean, it's a tragic case, isn't it? And it goes back a long way. I mean, I think, you know, in general, I think the issue of reparations for history needs to be approached cautiously. But I mean, I think that, you know, there's no doubt that France impoverished Haiti in the 19th century. That's, I mean, more than it would otherwise have been. Where do you start? I mean, I think you need security, but you also need some politicians who are effective and have some legitimacy. There's not much appetite from the outside world to intervene, I think. I mean, we've seen that. There's not much. I think my sense is that Haitians have a very ambivalent attitude towards outside intervention. I mean, the Haitian civil society, to the extent that it exists, has its criticisms of outside intervention, but they have not been able to kind of ensure minimum degrees of stability without it. It really is a failed state. So, I mean, I think one can just hope rather than expect that, you know, a transitional council and some kind of international support. And the Brazilians, I think, I was surprised. I mean, Was talking to a Brazilian diplomat a few weeks ago, and he thought that the Lula government would be up for taking some kind of role in Haiti. I mean, so who knows? I assume they would want others to be there as well, but and whether it would involve security forces or not, I don't know. But I mean, we'll see. Sorry.
On Haiti, it's also a manifestation of the lack of the region to deal with important regional issues. Now, take migration. Also, I mean, have you seen, given your history in analyzing Latin America, have you seen a point in history? I mean, maybe there were others, I'm sure, but it seems that regional cooperation is one at its lowest points, no?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and that is partly a reflection of domestic political polarization. And so you have these presidents who have not got into the job by promising moderation, who don't want to be seen collaborating with people whom they have held up as ideological, rhetorical foes. And again, one comes back to Boric, that in a favorable light, that I went to Chile for his inauguration, and he gave a conference for the international press, and he said about regional. I asked him about regional integration, and he said, "You do integration. You don't do integration with your friends. You do integration with your opponents." I think that's absolutely right. I mean, with your friends, you have friendship. You need integration structures to collaborate with your opponent, right? Unfortunately, that has not been the position of many left-wing leaders in the region who've wanted to turn schemes of regional integration into schemes of ideological preference rather than identifying common national interests where you can work together. That all of that on the one hand, and on the other hand, the scale of the transnational problems, I think, is greater than ever in Latin America. And that includes organized crime. It includes a kind of world in which power is fragmented more than it was in the past. It includes migration, as you mentioned. It includes Haiti and a failed state there. It includes defending democracy in the region. And so, I mean, I would just say one last thing on that. I always shudder when I hear Latin American leaders, and many, many, many of them do, say we should be inspired by the European Union. The European Union is never going to be a model for Latin America. The European Union is an extraordinary exception in the world. I say that as a convinced British Remainer who's still in mourning for Brexit. But the European Union is the product of unique circumstances, of this terrible history of intrastate war, which fortunately Latin America has not had, and of a very compact geography without major geographical obstacles, right? And Latin America does not have that. I've often showed a slide in which a whole of the European, sorry, I obviously forgot in this. And the whole of the European Union, including the UK, fits with considerable room to spare inside Brazil, inside the boundaries of Brazil. Yeah. And so Latin America has to do its own philosophical scheme of integration, which I think needs to be less ambitious. You should not start at the end with talking about single currencies. You should start at the beginning by agreeing to collaborate on the things you can collaborate.
International organized crime is spreading across many countries in Latin America, and and the people is demanding more and more strong answers. This kind of crime and gang crime is getting more and more violent, and we are in this kind of pendulum from far right and far left. In this scenario, do you see an opportunity for center parties to arise?
I think the job is to create center parties that can have opportunities, actually, and I think that's where what I said about the need for new kinds of political organizations and political platforms and new forms of communication is absolutely. Oh dear. Come ese microfono. uh, I mean, a lot of center parties are discredited for the reasons I said. I think that partly too many people, because they've been a minister or whatever, think they should be president, right? I mean, Colombia is a good example of that, right? Instead of doing the hard work of building a credible party. How do you build a credible party? I mean, I remember the days when you could go around Latin American countries and you would find offices of political parties in small towns. And you would find these people there who, were the rank and file of those parties. And, what motivated them? Well, it was a bit of ideology, a bit of belief, a bit of, the hope of a bit of bread and jam coming from, the being part of the political system, and that's legitimate, depending on how it's done. But I mean, it's in principle legitimate. I think you just don't find that anymore. You find a lot of stuff on social media. You still have some parties that are quite big and quite important. But they're often, I mean, let's take the Workers' Party in Brazil. I mean, they're a good example of a very successful political party, quite implanted in parts of Brazilian society. And it's kind of moved more and more into its shell of identity politics and distance itself from, many of the concerns of the citizens as a whole. I think Lula to a lesser extent, but sometimes that comes through in what Lula says and does, right? So how do you rebuild a sense of, there are many things that we have more in common than what divides us, and that's an issue I think across the democratic world. And I don't think it's going to be a quick process, but I think it starts in civil society. And I think it starts with, building new political organizations. There are some examples. I mean, Claudia Lopez, the mayoress of Bogota, for example, who's just who left office at the beginning of this year. She is an openly lesbian politician. First time she was elected in Colombia, which tells you a lot about Bogota, but not the whole of Colombia. And it shows that more modern society that I mentioned. But she also did a lot of kind of reaching out, to use the horrible American expression, to the citizens of Bogota about specific issues, right, that she thought was important, and setting up forums for discussion. And she won. And, she had her ups and downs in office, but I think she's generally seen as a pretty successful politician in Colombia. So, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that, old style political parties are probably not going to work. And that rebuilding the center is about communicating political things that are of relevance to citizens' daily lives, right? And because Latin Americans, like everywhere, don't live by rhetoric and hatred alone, right? And so I think there's scope for a backlash against polarization. There has to be mobilization.
Any comment about the upcoming elections in the US? I know you mentioned at the beginning that the influence has changed a bit, and there are other actors, particularly in economic terms, but Trump versus Biden, and we are still debating that in terms of, population, in theory, closer or not, but what's going to happen?
Well, I think the US is still very influential in Latin America, particularly at the level of an example, right? And it's the place where Latin Americans, well, Europe as well, but it's where they want to emigrate to, it's not China, it's not Russia, it's not Iran, it's not Cuba. And so I think it is influential, I think it's important. I think a Trump, there was a very good article in the FT on Saturday by a guy called Ivan Krastev, who's a Bulgarian political scientist. He's a very interesting thinker, liberal thinker. And he said, I think absolutely rightly, that that when populists get back into power, their priority is revenge. And I think that will be the case, and it's what I think is worrying for the US. I think it's worrying for particularly for the northern part of Latin America, which is much closer to the US and much more tied to it in many ways, and it matters, And yesterday we had a discussion at the Institute about Mexico, and obviously it's in the firing line. And the election is obviously still open. It's obviously still closed. I think one can say that the Biden administration has been uninspiring in Latin America. But and that's mainly because there are many other things going on in the world, and it's mainly because Latin America is in this paradoxical position in relation to US policy, that it's at the bottom of the list of foreign policy priorities, and it's at the top of the list of relevance to daily life in this country. And so Latin American policy has become an extension of domestic policy, and it's all about migration. It used to be all about drugs. It's still partly about drugs. And that is a problem for Latin America, but it's not going to change.
That with that note, that I think you also said, I mean, at the end of the day, the key issues for Latin America need to be resolved by Latin Americans and by Latin American countries. However, I think it will be important eventually to see, you mentioned that, I mean, Latin America is not at the center of the geopolitical tensions, but it's a theater of competition between the US and China. And hopefully, I mean, US policy will also recognize this with a more active role in Latin America. But having said that, let me just close by thanking you, by spending these 2 days with us, by thanking you for this very deep and interesting conversation, by reminding us how much we have lost by not being able to read you every Friday afternoon or Saturday morning in each edition of the Economist, and we really hope that after your very successful detour with your Spain book, you come back to Latin America with your new book with a view that actually fleshes out a lot of the things that you discussed with us today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Alejandro. It was great. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, I mean, I do still write sometimes in The Economist, and I write a monthly column in Letras Libres, a Mexican Spanish magazine, just as a commercial. And there'll be another book on something at some point.